Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second virtual member assembly meeting this year. I'm Vicki Best, and I serve as the Director of Operations and Development for the American Scientific Affiliation. In the midst of the pandemic and much adaptation taking place in all our lives, we're delighted to be partnering with InterVarsity's Emerging Scholars Network to bring you this timely event on Leading Lives with Purpose, the science of discerning your calling and work for a lifetime. To live your calling is a choice, and our discernment journey begins by locating one's particular story within God's larger story, thinking across the disciplines, especially the richness of theological vision and the rigor of scientific insight. It's important for us to develop eyes to see why our work is an integral to the very work of God. After we sent our first communication out about this event back in August, I received an email from a longstanding member who's in his 80s asking me if he was too old to attend. And my response to him was, absolutely not. Your calling is not over until the day you meet Jesus face to face. We want all of our members at all stages of life to attend so we can all learn from each other. We're thrilled to have attendees from various stages in their callings and life stories. Those in their 20s, 40s, 60s, 80s, and maybe even a few approaching 100. So we're glad to spend the next 90 minutes with you. I know you're in for a real treat as Bryan brings his years of thoughtful reflection and research. And three of our members, Jennifer, Joshua, and John, at different stages in their careers, share their personal stories of vocation and calling as Christians in the sciences. Our sincere hope is that God will bless you along the way. Let me give you an overview of how our evening will run and what you can look forward to. First and foremost, we want you to be social and friendly, and I see that is already happening in the chat button. So continue to use the chat to greet each other and to ask questions. You can't see each other now, but just wait, you will see each other soon. And if any of you are in your PJs, you might want to change out of them. In the meantime, say hello to old friends, meet new ones in the chat box. Secondly, I want to recognize our sponsors for tonight, Templeton Press and select ASA donors who helped underwrite this evening and Bryan Dik's book, Redeeming Work, that many of you received in the mail. Now for the format of the evening, we will use the roundtable style. It's a particular format with some real benefits of discussion and getting to know each other, used by David Tom, the leader of the Cambridge Roundtable here at Harvard and other Ivies around the country. After Bryan's presentation, we'll hear testimonials from Jennifer and Joshua. Then we'll go into breakout rooms of intergenerational small groups for a time of discussion and get to knowing each other, followed by a Q&A time with Bryan and John. Then we'll allow Bryan 2 minutes to have the last word before we close the program. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, John Wood, who is serving a dual role as interim executive director and president of the Executive Council, both of which she is most definitely called, even after enjoying a few years of retirement. You might consider him co-vocational, and he'll be the first to admit how much fun he's having these days working with the ASA staff on a daily basis. John?
Thanks, Vicki. That's yeah, it is fun. We do have a good time, and it's a virtual good time. We're across the country from one another, and COVID has prevented me from being in the office, physically, really since last February. I think was the last time I was down in the Boston area. So it's just great. Welcome, everyone. It's good to quote see you and have you with us. So. Tonight, we're privileged to have Bryan Dik with us, a professor of counseling psychology at Colorado State University at Fort Collins. Bryan is one of our class of 2020 ASA Fellows. So congratulations, Bryan, on that honor, and it's well deserved. And if you haven't had a chance to read Bryan's CV or see this, you're going to hear a lot from him tonight. His research is uniquely situated for the time we find ourselves in today. Bryan's resume includes awards for outstanding achievement in career and personality research in the area of applied psychology of religion and spirituality. He and his colleagues in their field have undertaken the challenge of conceptualizing the idea of calling, of measuring satisfaction at work, and of building a theoretical model to frame all of this research. His research spans from relational support for young workers and early career choices to longitudinal studies. He surveys older workers. He does investigations of authenticity, in the enhancing of social justice in career development. So you can see he has a broad range of interests and expertise. Over the past 15 years, he's built an outstanding base for understanding career, vocation, and calling, and we are extremely happy to have Bryan with us tonight. Let me tell you how this next little short portion is going to go. We want to place Bryan's thoughts in the context of our lives, and so the three of us here are going to do that along this work, life, career spectrum. I'm going to do a little talking right now, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bryan. After Bryan speaks, then we're going to hear from two specially invited guests. These individuals are at different points in their career pathway. All of us are Christians, and all of us feel deeply that sense of God's calling into our lives. But these folks are experienced scientists, and they've navigated the challenges of graduate school and are roughly somewhere near the beginning, that's where Josh is at, or the middle of their career and toward the end of the career. So after Bryan, we'll hear from who we'll hear from first, then we'll hear from Joshua Ho. He will be new to many of you in the audience tonight, but he is not new to thinking deeply about faith and science. Josh has been involved in InterVarsity since starting his undergraduate study. He was a leader in the Graduate Christian Fellows at Washington University in St. Louis, where his research in his master's and PhD research focused on the cell cycle during the RNA-mediated reprogramming of fibroblasts into neurons. I'm a field ecologist. You got to forgive me for stumbling, Josh, over terms that I haven't taught or said for a while. This graduate study set Josh up for something interesting. It set him up for entry-level work into researching technical patent law issues. It's a field that's at the center of some of the deepest ethical and scientific challenges that we face today. Josh will give you some idea of how he's navigating that transition out of his graduate work into this professional field. And he'll talk briefly about his experience at this beginning stage. And then Jennifer Weissman will come, an ASA member since her Harvard graduate school days, and she's well known to us in the ASA audience. So Jennifer is a NASA astrophysicist and a person of faith. She's a senior scientist for the Hubble Science Telescope. And she told me last spring something interesting about that the COVID pandemic has not actually interrupted her research, as it has for many in laboratories across the country. That is, as long as she or a colleague can actually get into the lab once a week to do a massive download of data from the Hubble Space Telescope and to free up storage for that next round of observations, apparently you can sit in the comfort of your living room, maybe with your PJs on, and do work on astrophysics and multi-molecular views of stellar nurseries, one of her recent publications, and other intriguing work. She sits really at the edge of our understanding of how the universe works and has had a remarkable career. A decade ago, Jennifer took on an additional role with DOSER, the Dialogue on Science and Ethics and Religion project. It fits between science and seminaries. The executive officer of AAAS, Alan Leshner, said at that time that Jennifer is not only an accomplished scientist, but she understands both the importance of religion in American life and how deep knowledge of the natural world need not threaten religious belief. And that's a remarkable testament from an employer and a professional in the field for the work that she's been doing. So later on, she'll give us a glimpse into the arc of her career as God has called her. All of us know that once we begin our scientific work in the lab or in the clinic or in industry, government, the academy, or business, that an entirely new suite of challenges arise. With growing experience comes increasing responsibility. So this pathway is unique to every one of us, and the demands of home and church and community and our career are as varied as each of us are. Tonight, we are stopping to ask, what does call and vocation look like through that broad middle stage throughout one's career, or end stage? How does it end? Well, you know that I'm interested. If you've seen any of my work or heard my talks, you know that I'm interested in endings. I've published on the necessity of death. So finitudes and endings have been on my mind for many years. I formally retired 3 years ago from the King's University, 70 and out. That was my mantra then. And now, after a couple of years of being fully retired, I find myself in what is often called a second half career here at the ASA. And it is, as Vicki said, delightful. But that's not unique to me. There are all kinds of folks who are repurposing their careers along the way. And you know, I actually started thinking about this, how did I get started this? Well, it was actually my pastor. It was in high school, and a conversation with my pastor, Reverend Worth Hodgin. And in that conversation, he said, and he was very intentional about what he was doing. He said, "John, we need men like you in the ministry. So you need to go to North Park College in Chicago, and you need to do undergraduate study, anything you want. And then you need to go off and go to seminary and become a pastor." And that was my intention when I went to Chicago. Well, as you can see, across my career, I haven't been a pastor. I've been speaking a lot. I've talked for my career, but not in the pulpit on a regular basis, and not in professional ministry of that kind. And often we wonder, well, is that really service? And I struggled with that as an undergraduate, and there were not many people to talk with me about that. And I wondered about that late in my career as well. And a friend of mine I met, some 15 years ago, he's a communications engineer, worked with Bell Labs, Rick Baugh, had written a little book, and it was around the theme and the question that he and his friends were asking: did Jesus waste most of his life? After all, he was nearly 30 before he got into his real ministry. And that question that Rick is asking, and really I've asked it, many others have, is a kind of thing that pops up, I think, and it pops up throughout history. We wonder, does our life matter? Does our work really count in the day-to-day? His little book is called Work Loves Your Neighbor, and it fits a theme that is becoming more and more common. Tim Keller recently pointed out in his book, Every Good Endeavor, that work does love our neighbors. Our work are the fingers of God. They're the agents of his providential love for others. Work not only cares for creation, but it also directs and structures it. Our work as scientists, engineers, doctors, lawyers too, all the forms of work that we do are the blessing of God that cause the flourishing of creation. All of us sense that there's some new dynamic at play in our work lives these days. There's change afoot at every stage of our lives. Yes, the pandemic is magnifying it, but it will not last forever. And what does God have in store for me in the wake of this season? Or if not directly for me, what advice can I give my family or my friends or my colleagues who are facing life-altering career change? We've asked Bryan to speak to us tonight out of his research in vocational counseling and psychology, in 2 book-length treatments, the recent Redeeming Workbook and his earlier Make Make Your Job a Calling. He explains his research exploring vocation and workplace spirituality. And Bryan is going to bring that to us tonight. Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you so much, John. It's a huge privilege for me to be with you in this way tonight. 88 participants on this call right now on a Friday evening. That's pretty astounding, and I'm really grateful for it. We know you've got alternatives, so for you to choose to share this time and engage in some conversation around calling and vocation is super exciting to me. I'm going to share my screen and then start this slideshow. And I changed the title a little bit. I think that the Spirit has been moving within me as we navigate this pandemic. I've been thinking a lot about what that might mean in terms of living out our calling. And so part of what we'll do tonight is explore what element that may play in how we engage this question. When I talk about this, I often share a little bit about myself and my own journey because it's really closely tied with what I've ended up doing. There's some ironies in it. I started as an undergraduate student at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And that was a time for me where I was really kind of struggling with making major life decisions. And one of those was in the career realm. I was interested in lots of things, and the thought of choosing one path, if that meant not choosing another path, was very difficult for me. And so I remember retreating to the many prayer rooms scattered across campus, including the one in the basement of our dorm, and just sort of kneeling on that prayer bench and pleading with God to reveal to me his will for my career. I remember saying things like, "I'll do whatever you want me to do, just make it clear." And I don't know that I expected an audible voice, but I did believe that if I just prayed earnestly enough, then the answer would somehow be revealed, either in an epiphany or I would wake up one morning and just know, that kind of thing. It didn't quite go that way. And I ended up deciding on psychology because it was as interesting as the other things, and I happened to have more credits in psych than in other disciplines. At the time I was moving into my junior year and had to actually put something on the form. So I studied psychology, and then I had to figure out what to do after I graduated. And I was a good enough student that I thought, I'll go to graduate school. And I was very fortunate to providentially get into the program in counseling psychology at the University of Minnesota. And I chose counseling psych on purpose. It was because I knew that of all the areas of psychology, counseling psychologists did the broadest array of things. They could teach, they could do research, they could go into private practice, they could consult for organizations. So I knew that by pursuing this path, I could effectively, delay the decision of what I was going to do when I grew up. Ironically, I was too naive to realize this before I landed there, but once I set foot on campus and started interacting with the faculty and other students in the program, I quickly started to realize that this program was long known for its contributions to research, theory, and practice related to career development. I think I took 6 courses related to career development as a PhD student, along with all the other stuff. And in fact, we had a training clinic, a vocational assessment clinic. And I worked as a counselor in that clinic, mostly with middle career adults who were objectively very successful, many of them, and subjectively totally miserable. Some of them could hardly get out of bed in the morning. They hated their work so much. And that was interesting to me. What was especially interesting to me was many of them, without any prompting from me, would spontaneously say something like, I wish I had discovered my calling. Meanwhile, even while I'm serving in a counselor role, facilitating career assessment and counseling, I'm still grappling with this decision myself, doing a lot of reading, mainly from the practical theology genre. And at some point I decided, I'm training to become a psychologist. Maybe I should figure out what psychologists have had to say about this calling idea. So I conducted a literature review, and I think at that time I found fewer than 10 studies, 10 empirical studies, attempts to apply the methods of science to try to investigate what this notion of calling looks like in people's lives. And that maybe was where the epiphany happened, and I kind of mulled it over and decided, maybe part of what I'm on this earth to do is apply some of the training and knowledge and experiences that I had gained up to that point to better understand what it actually looks like for people to discern and live out a calling. So I was very fortunate to find a position at Colorado State University in the psychology department. They were specifically looking for someone who could teach a couple of their graduate career development courses in the counseling psych program, and I've been there since 2005. And along the way, the university helped us create a company to develop tools that apply some of what we had learned in our research. So one of the things I set out to do when I started that job 15 years ago was develop a program of research specifically on calling. And when you do that, you have to start by carefully defining what it is you're going to study. And so I tried to do that in a way that honored my Christian worldview, and but that what made me successful at publishing this stuff in mainstream journals within the discipline. And so we approached it in a way that I think honors a Christian perspective on this, but yet allowed me at that point in time to keep my faith commitments somewhat implicit because of the pressures of being a pre-tenured faculty person at a large public research university. So we described a calling as having three dimensions: a transcendent summons, the idea that the word calling implies a caller. In a country like the U.S., for a lot of people, the caller is identified as God, but from a purely psychological perspective, it doesn't necessarily need to be. It could be a salient social need or a family legacy. It's just the idea that something beyond the self is compelling a person or drawing a person in to approach their work this way. The second dimension is an alignment of work purpose with life purpose. It's this idea that what we do all day is not sealed off or compartmentalized away from what matters most to us in life, but rather the two are in sync. And then number three, a pro-social orientation. This is the idea that I approach my work this way, not principally for my own happiness, but to make a contribution to the world around me. The paradox being that when we're focused on contributing to the well-being of others, directly or indirectly, it makes us very happy. So we defined the concept. Then the next step, if you're trying to build a program of research, is to measure it. I went to a grad program where they said that if a thing exists in nature, it can be measured. If two things exist, they can be correlated. So can we measure a sense of calling? Answers, of course we can. So we developed a scale to measure that. It's a self-report scale. I'll spare you the gritty details of scale development research, but I did want to at least show you an image of the measurement model because I think it's aesthetically pleasing. You've seen things like this if you do measurement research in the social sciences. Some people may quibble, hey, this is self-report. People might not know themselves well or feel social desirability and just say what they think the researcher wants to hear or what's socially acceptable to hear. But we actually asked people in our original set of scale development studies to nominate other people who knew them well. And then we contacted those people and asked them to respond to the same items as if they were the target person. And then we looked at the pattern of relationships between self-report and other report. And this is part of the process of establishing reliability and validity for an instrument. So just to give you a feel for what is included in our scale, the actual scale, the Calling and Vocation Questionnaire, has 24 items. These are 3 of them. So take a minute, I'll read these and think about how you'd rate yourself on these along this 4-point scale from not at all true of me to totally true of me. Number 1, I was drawn by something beyond myself to pursue my current line of work. Number 2, my work helps me live out my life's purpose. Number 3, making a difference for others is the primary motivation in my career. Now, if you read these statements and think, oh yeah, that explains me perfectly, you probably score high on our presence of calling scale. And if you think, no, that doesn't really describe me at all right now, you'd probably score low, and most people score somewhere in the middle. But once you have a way of quantifying a sense of calling, then you can include a scale like this in lots of surveys along with scales that measure other things and then see how all those things are related. And this has happened in lots of studies. And what we've learned is that people with a calling are more confident and comfortable with their career choices. They're happier at work. They're more committed both to their careers and to their organizations. And they put in more effort at work than do people who think of their work in other ways. So a sense of calling is associated with a lot of career development benefits. But not only that, people who think of their work as a calling also feel that life as a whole is more meaningful and satisfying than do people who think of their work in other ways. So there are links to this kind of broader sense of well-being as well. And you might be saying, hey, are these correlational studies? And correlation doesn't equal causation, and that's definitely true. But as John mentioned, there have been a number of longitudinal studies which allow you to start looking at how these things relate to each other at multiple time points. And what we've learned from that is really that the causal arrows go in both directions. Having a sense of calling does seem to cause people to experience satisfaction and well-being, and those positive feelings serve to reinforce that sense of calling. So it's a kind of a positive upward spiral. Now, one of the things that before I get to that point, I should say that the early studies of calling within the last 15 years were carried out within the US and Canada, but it's become a global phenomenon. And this list here is not an exhaustive list. It's a representative sample. There are more than 30 countries now represented in the literature. In fact, in 2017, I had the privilege of speaking at the first ever International Conference on Calling Research in Amsterdam. And, what's striking is that across all of these diverse cultures, the similarities are more striking than the differences. There are some subtle differences cross-culturally, but to the extent that Viktor Frankl was correct in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that the search for meaning is a human universal, a human instinct, I think it stands to reason that we would see this play out everywhere that people are working. They want their work to matter. They want it to make sense. Now, one of the things that we discovered within the last 6 or 7 years is that it's not enough to have a calling. Having a calling and living a calling are, in fact, different things. We thought this would be the case, so we devised a scale that measures living a calling and administered that along with our scale that measures perceiving a calling, and we found that they correlated 0.46. And if you're rusty on your statistics, a correlation coefficient ranges from -1 to 1, and the closer the values get to either negative or positive 1, the stronger the relationship between two variables. 0.46 is a fairly strong relationship by social science standards. It's strong enough where our palms get sweaty and our heart rate increases. But it's nowhere near 1.0. So this tells us that there's a lot of overlap between perceiving and living a calling, but they're different things. In fact, it is possible for a person to feel like they have a calling but not feel that they're living it out. And when we looked at how these two variables correlated with some pretty key criterion variables, we found that there were some differences. So perceiving a calling, if you look at that middle column, those three correlations with work meaning, career commitment, and job satisfaction range from 0.23 to 0.34. So there's a relationship and it's positive. These things are related, but it's not super strong. Whereas if you look at the numbers in that right column, living a calling is very strongly correlated with meaning and commitment and job satisfaction, which started to tell us maybe it's not about having it, it's about living it. And when we started to look at how these variables interact, we found that sure enough, we knew that having a calling was linked to well-being, but when we statistically accounted for living a calling, that relationship between having a calling and well-being went away. And so one of the interpretations of this is that a key reason that having a calling is linked to well-being is that a lot of people who have a calling are able to take steps to actively live it out. And so it's not just about having a calling, it's about living it. Now, there are tons and tons of implications. And there's, of course, a lot more research, more than 600 studies now in the literature when there were fewer than 10 just over 15 years ago. So this is still a small area within psychology, but it's rapidly growing. We've learned a lot. And so, John mentioned these two books. This is my shameless plug. If you want lots and lots of details, we packaged them in these two books. This first one with my friend and colleague from University of Florida, Ryan Duffy. Make Your Job a Calling was written for the general market, but then finally this year I was able to pull these ideas together and package them for Christians, for fellow Christians. But both of these were published before we had this pandemic. And it's a really interesting question. How does this pandemic change things? And that's what I want to focus the rest of my time on is, what does living a calling look like in the middle of a pandemic? Now, you've all seen images like this every day, these scary graphs that show the numbers of positive COVID cases. That orange line is India. They seem to be starting to figure things out after a really high peak in September. The green line is the US, and you're reading about us heading toward our third peak. Congratulations, Canada. You're not included in the 10 most affected countries, so you're not, you don't have a line to worry about on that. But there's an economic fallout as well. When you think about what the pandemic is doing to career development, this image is from the US Department of Labor, and it shows the continuing unemployment claims in the US. And we peaked in a scary way at the beginning of May, and things have gotten a little bit better, but they're still not great. There are some sectors of the economy that have actually somehow benefited from the pandemic, but many of them have been decimated. And so there's a lot of folks that are out of work. And we're used to, by now, seeing headlines like this, 2020 to end with the highest unemployment rates since the Depression. And if you work in higher ed, which I know a lot of you do, then it's a little scary. How should we plan for an uncertain future where the only thing we can count on at this point is that budgets are going to be profoundly affected? So, yeah, a lot of you probably feel, I know I do, like this kid. You're just sort of watching all this unfold, doing what you can to keep your spirits up, but just longing for things to go back to normal, while recognizing that the normal that they will go back to is going to be a little bit different than what things were like prior to the pandemic. So in the time I have left, I want to focus on what I think are 3 truths about pursuing your calling in the COVID era. The first one, understanding your gifts, is essential. And this is the case across the lifespan, by the way. When I talk about gifts, the things that we assess as vocational psychologists, when we talk about gifts, interests, values, personality, and so forth, these things are highly stable. They don't change very much into older adulthood on average. And the basic idea of engaging with things that really leverage your gifts continues on. Number 2, the ability to adapt to a changing reality is more important now than ever. And then number 3, living your calling is fundamentally about aligning your story with God's story. So let's take each one of these one at a time. This first one, understanding gifts, is essential. This is one of the pieces of advice I'd give the 19-year-old me when I was pleading with God for a divine revelation, thinking about, Moses and the burning bush. If you read theologians, they'll say God in his wisdom tends not to communicate his voice, or kind of direct communication is the exception. It's not the rule. And so that being the case, for the rest of us, we have to look at factors that mediate God's calling. And a key one of those is clearly our gifts. We see signs of this in the New Testament. Paul talks about this in several places. Here's an example. In 1 Corinthians, there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in every one, it is the same God at work. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. And elsewhere, Paul uses the metaphor of the body. There are multiple parts of the body. One can't say to the next, you're not important. All of them are important. They all have to work together. Clearly, Paul is talking to the church here, and he's talking about spiritual gifts. But if you wanted to take this general principle and generalize it to the world of work, you'd be in good company. Luther did that, and Calvin, and then the Puritans took the ball and ran with it. And in fact, if you look at research on individual differences you'll see that this basic concept really does seem to work. There have been meta-analyses, studies of studies that have examined the notion that the degree of fit between a person on the basis of their interests, values, personality, and so forth, and their environments actually does predict outcomes. So let me decode this for you. These are correlations between different levels of person-environment fit and then some pretty key career-related outcomes. So that first one, person-job fit, that tells us, 0.56, that the degree of fit between a person and his or her job is pretty strongly related to job satisfaction. And PO, that's person-organization fit. The greater the fit between a person and the organization, the more committed they are to that organization. It works on the team level, and it works even on the dyad level. And so, we were privileged to start a company that starts to develop tools and products that leverages some of this research. And I wanted to give you something here. Just write down this URL. If you did receive the book Redeeming Work, then it's also embedded in the book. If you go to this URL, you can create a profile and take a set of assessments and then see what our algorithms will predict for you in terms of career paths that we think fit you well. I'll give you a sense, this is my second shameless plug, a real quick sense of what this looks like. We look at interests and values and personality and workplace culture preferences. All of these are things that are highly stable. And that's important because if you're wanting to give people information they can use to make informed decisions with, it's pretty key that you're measuring things that are stable. So we measure these things in people, we give them feedback, and then we have algorithms that we just got a patent on last year that will scour the U.S. Department of Labor's Occupational Information Network and then show you a list of occupations that fit you well on the basis of your unique profile. You can click on any of those, get all kinds of detailed information about what it looks like to pursue this career. And then we even have a job board. You can search for open jobs by location, wherever you are, and then see what open jobs in your area are predicted to be a good fit for you. There's a workbook you can download that's free that will help you kind of decode your results and look for themes in there. And then a set of tools to equip you with the nuts and bolts of landing a job. Cover letters, resumes, establishing a network, prepping for interviews, all the way to negotiating a job offer. So all that stuff's in there. Try it out. redeemingwork.pathwayu.com. That bypasses the paywall. And it's just sort of like my expression of gratitude to you for attending this tonight or reading that book is to try that out and see what you think. Number two, the ability to adapt is more important now than ever. Now, this is not something that's really new, honestly, to COVID, but COVID has poured gasoline on it. So even prior to the pandemic, we've talked about the changing world of work. There's been a rise in the gig economy. Employers are less loyal than they've ever been. And so people are having to engage in various jobs that they piece together in self-employment. And that's something that is now, that shift that already was happening is now happening much more rapidly. Ubiquitous computing, the internet of everything. Every job is becoming a tech job. And so part of what all of us have to do is familiarize ourselves with new technology on an ongoing basis. This is just part of our new reality. And COVID is just making this happen much more quickly than it already was. And then finally, the rise of automation. So the robots that are coming for our jobs. This is maybe an extension of B here, but this is a key part of it as well. As everything becomes more automated, that shifts where work is most needed. And in order to cope with all of this, we have to develop something that vocational psychologists call career adaptability. Career adaptability is a readiness and resources for coping with this type of change. And, there's 4 parts to it, the 4 C's. It's very alliterative. If I had more time, I'd walk through all of those right now. But basically what this all refers to is an ability to develop resources for adjusting to change. It requires a learning orientation. It requires a kind of curiosity and an ongoing quest to continually learn. There have been measures of career adaptability that have been developed and that have been used in a number of studies. There are now meta-analyses of career adaptability. And what we've learned from that is that adaptability is linked across more than 100 studies now to reduced job stress, enhanced deployability and promotability, increased work engagement, job performance, job and life satisfaction, and a sense of calling. So I think coping with these changing realities really requires right now this kind of enhanced ability to adapt. And then finally, this of course has always been true. Living your calling is really about aligning your story with God's story. And, you know, from a purely psychological level, there is a model that has been used to kind of help us look at this general without being tied directly to the Christian worldview. And that's Crystal Park's global meaning system framework. She believes, Crystal Park, she's a social psychologist at University of Connecticut, that everybody has a global meaning system, a set of beliefs, goals, and values, whether they can articulate it or not. Okay, in Christian circles, we'd call this a worldview. She believes everyone has this worldview, and then everyone has a daily experience of meaning. You know, we make sense of what we do day in and day out. So what does this look like at work? Well, the model suggests that the more closely aligned a person's global meaning system is with their daily experience of meaning, the more meaningful and satisfying the work is. And there's evidence to suggest this is the case, even without regard to paying attention to the content of someone's global meaning system. We just seem to be created in such a way where we flourish when we're living integrated lives, when different parts of our lives are not sealed off from each other, but when they're connected into a whole and there's coherence. But you know what this looks like for Christians. You know, we turn to Scripture to figure out what our global meaning system is. And Scripture paints this picture of God's plan for the world that can be described at a really high level as sort of like a play with 4 acts: creation, fall, redemption, and renewal. We know that God created the world. I know ASA members love to investigate and debate and talk about what mechanisms he may have used to do that. But we all agree that God created the world. And, you know, in Genesis 1:28, God gives people instructions. The first instructions to humans was this cultural mandate: be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And one of the things that means for us today is that we're called to care for creation, for sure, to steward it, but also to develop it, to coax out its created potential. And that is super exciting. We know that when Adam and Eve sinned, sin entered the world. That did more than just disrupt people's relationships with God. It made the whole creation tainted and distorted and not the way it's supposed to be. But fortunately, God sent us Jesus. And Jesus walked the earth. He taught us how to live. He died this brutal death on the cross and was raised again 3 days later. And through that sacrificial act and that raising up, redemption occurred, not just between our relationship with each other or with God, but for the whole creation. So in Colossians, we see God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So this kind of redemption of the full creation is something that Christ guaranteed with his death and resurrection. And we experience a taste of this. We experience the meaning and purpose, the grace that comes with that redemption. But we don't experience this fully. We won't until Christ returns and makes everything new and brings heaven to earth. That's the renewal that we long for and are working toward now. So our role is as an agent of renewal. And I'll close with this. In 2 Corinthians, it says, all this is from God who reconciles us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. I just love how Al Walters pulls together that Colossians passage with this 2 Corinthians one and says, if Christ is the reconciler of all things, and if we've been entrusted with the ministry of reconciliation on his behalf, then we have a redemptive task wherever our vocation places us in his world. That's the case in science, certainly. That's the case everywhere within creation, because Christ is Lord over every inch of it. That's the case when we're retired and enjoying our sphere of influence in retirement. I think the significance of this view of the world that believers enjoy in terms of engaging our own callings and thinking of our work as vocation is profound. And I'm super excited to hear examples of this from our panel this evening. So that's the end of my portion of the program, and I now have the privilege of passing the torch over to Joshua Ho, who you will hear from next.
Hey, everyone. Hey, thanks so much for such an amazing presentation, Brian. That was, frankly, like something that also was speaking to me, even as I'm listening to on the panel. And thank you so much earlier for John for the gracious introduction. So as you can kind of tell, I'm the early career person, and so to give a bit more of a history of where I was. So I was in graduate school at Washington University here in St. Louis, and I actually happened to graduate this past December. And this process, as I'm finishing up and leaving lab, the entire thing of the global pandemic hits. So as I'm searching for a job, as I'm leaving the lab, everything comes down and hits. And this is a place where I'm like, I mean, frankly, it is terrifying. It's something that I don't think no one else could really predict. No one else could have predicted it, and we're all trying to figure out what this new world looks like. But I think something that has undergirded me in these past 2 months has been the sense that God is still, whatever God has brought me through my process of graduate school, through cultivating and putting in me all these curiosities about how does life itself work in different parts from. So just to give a little bit more depth to my scientific background, in my undergraduate years at Vanderbilt, I studied stem cell differentiation from embryonic stem cells into cardiomyocytes. And in my graduate work, I actually worked in a lab where we reprogrammed human skin neurons directly into adult human neurons. It's kind of crazy, but I think just as I was processing what that all means, like, God, what did you teach me here to bring this curiosity about, like, how does your work happen in the very first place? But then also to put me into a place where I get to interact with all these crazy new ways of understanding and new applications of how science works. I think that's a fantastic thing, and that's kind of something where I find myself, at least at this particular stage of my career, is transitioning into a place where I am in the process of working actually over at Bayer, formerly Monsanto, where I'm learning a completely different set of skills, completely different set of science, but understand that I'm also working here, learning how the science gets done, but then also understanding how do we take the knowledge that we've built up in terms of how do we help crops grow faster? How do we help crops grow more healthily, provide more nutrition, or are more resistant to different parasites or pests in the field? Like, how do we do that so that way we can help human flourish and help this world flourish? So it's a very fascinating way. In the process of all of this, I'm, as John kind of alluded to, like with me understanding intellectual property, I'm actually also partly studying for the patent bar. So I'm kind of keeping multiple pokers in the iron, just trying to see, okay, God, what are you trying to do here? What are you trying to do here? What are you trying to do here? So that's where I am in my career, but I know that God is calling has had this call to me to kind of like be in this phase where something new is happening in the world, getting to talk to people, getting to share their excitement, but then also helping them. And perhaps this is something I'm still trying to understand myself, is how does this all work out in terms of a full career? What does that actually look like? Is it patent law? Or is it something else? I don't know just yet, but I am excited to see where God takes me in all of this. And next, we have Jennifer Wiseman coming up. So, yeah, and after her.
Thank you so much, Joshua and Brian. Am I heard now? Can you hear and see me? Okay. I'm assuming that I can be heard and seen. So let me just, great, okay. I want to share with you a few reflections of mid-career life. And I am so attuned to using slides and visuals because I'm an astronomer that I'm going to see if I can share my screen with you for a few minutes of reflections that hopefully will fertilize some of the smaller breakout discussions that we're going to have soon. So let me see if I can pull up a shared screen. Just to get you inspired, we do live in an incredible universe that I believe inspires wonder and awe. And it was this kind of thing when I was young that made me wonder if I could get into a space-related career. I didn't quite know how to do that, but fortunately I had some good encouragers and mentors and opportunities along the way. And so in graduate school, I learned how to use different kinds of telescopes, including telescopes that are on the ground, like the ones you see in the lower left and the lower right. My thesis work was using radio telescopes, like you see on the lower right. And I had to learn all of that from scratch. I didn't know anything about that. And then the space telescopes, like the one above, the Hubble Space Telescope, which is the mission that I'm involved with now. So there's me with a model of the Hubble telescope and the background galaxy behind it as observed with Hubble. But I didn't grow up doing this kind of work, looking at beautiful galaxies and stars and things like that. I grew up here in northern Arkansas in a farm family raising cattle out in the Ozark Hills, and my parents didn't even get to go to college. So, you know, establishing a sense of calling was something, you know, that had to be thought about early on, but I just knew I was interested in nature. So I continued to think about science and you know, wanted to see if I could do something involved with the nature that I loved in the space program. And fortunately, God opened the doors for a college education in that realm. After getting a PhD eventually in astronomy, I did some years of postdoctoral research, but I began to become uneasy with a research career, a career just focused on a very narrow but deep dive into, you know, important questions in astrophysics. But my mind was more like what I'd call spaghetti. I was really interested in how different things in our nation and our world fit together. And in fact, science is a part of that. And you can see this list here about how science is intertwined with other things now, including ethics and policy and education. So all of these topics that we care about in science are intimately intertwined with other parts of human life. And it was this interest in the intertwining of science with the bigger questions that made me, first of all, very uneasy and dissatisfied with the career path I was on. And so that sense of uneasiness was not pleasant. You know, I had to spend some time after 6 years of postdoctoral research wondering if I had made some big mistakes, a lot of prayer, seeking wisdom and applying for things out of the box. But through that time of feeling unhappy and uneasy and anxious, I finally found an opportunity to become a congressional science fellow and work on Capitol Hill, learning about how science impacts national policy. And that opened up new doors for me that I never would have imagined before. including working in oversight and management of science at federal agencies, which brought me into NASA, where I am now. So here are some mid-career reflections that I thought that I would share with you just to spawn some conversation. I have a slide of what I think either I or my friends have experienced and expressed that are good reflections about being in the mid-career stage. And then I also have a slide on the not so good. All right. So some of the good things about being in mid-career stage is that you can have some stability. Many people feel less volatility and motion in their job, their location, their family life, their income. Maybe even seeing some sense of recognition for work, seeing some fruit of work and experience. Maybe having some luxury of time to reflect on what is important, what is really worth pursuing, what is a best match to talents and interests. Often in an early stage of career, you don't have all that much luxury of choice. Some luxury even in creativity and choosing how to focus efforts. Often by mid-career, people have a little more influence and voice in science societies or institutional committees or national or institutional policies and organizations. And time for some grateful reflections, being grateful for one's family, for one's encouragers and mentors in career. I'm very grateful for my husband, Mark, who has always been a great encourager to me, for colleagues, and for looking back and seeing how God has been greatly faithful in all situations. And recognizing that diverse experiences in life and career have worked together to prepare one for future callings and opportunities. So these are the good parts of reflecting at one's mid-career. Sometimes challenging reflections can be maybe not always or even frequently having any strong sense of that being in the right place, doing all the right things. And so, some people say that they wake up every morning and they can't believe they're being paid for this dream job and they're being paid to do what they love to do, and their life is a dream. And I hope for some of you that's the case, but that's not true for most of us. There are continuing, in my experience, throughout mid-career anxieties. This is somewhat personality dependent as well, but sense of anxiety, senses of fear, sometimes regrets about what one has done or not done, or opportunities one has not had. Maybe even for some, a sense of resentment and jealousy if the things that we wanted to do, maybe we haven't achieved, but we see other people that seem to be sailing on doing the things we'd hoped to do. And then for many, there's a sense of, hey, wait, I never intended to be stuck in this ... So for some, that's being stuck in a job, stuck in a certain location, stuck in a certain institution or relationship or family situation or type of work, et cetera, and kind of thinking, how did I get in this position? Am I not in control of my own destiny? And I think about the Moses example we just saw. Moses had this fiery calling, but it occurred to me that, while God said, Moses, I want you to lead my people out of Egypt, he didn't give Moses an end date for this job. And in fact, it ended basically was the rest of his life. So, we can all have this sense of, well, wait a minute, how long am I supposed to be stuck in this situation? And what should we try to change and pursue while we still can, if we have the sense that time is running out? How should we best use our remaining career time? Should we take intentional action, trusting God, but taking action to get on a different career path, maybe go back to school or apply for other jobs? Or should we just continue doing what we're doing now the best we can, trusting that God will bring new opportunities to us if and when this is best? Which way do we trust God? And so, this is a question I can't answer, but it does involve for all of us walking with God, which is a never-ending interaction. And I will quote Dr. Mark John Shellhammer, who said, digressions and changes in direction are critical and are not an indicator of failure to find and pursue a calling. I think that's the great words of wisdom. And by the way, Dr. Shellhammer is my husband. All right, and I'm going to close with some verses that have been and encouragement to me. We all have different kind of default emotions, I think, and for me, it's sometimes fear. But Jesus promises that He's the vine, we're the branches, and if we remain in Him and He in us, that we will bear much fruit. Apart from Him, we can't do anything. He said, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you might go and bear fruit that will last." So remembering that we're not alone, God's chosen us, is helpful. Psalm 54:4 says, "Surely God is my help, the one who sustains me." And I often remember and that God has said He's our helper, and God has always helped me in every situation. And then here's a great verse for fear. "I sought the Lord and He answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to Him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame." And finally, I think this verse is good for all of us today. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. That's our prayer to God, that He will guide and establish the work of our hands individually and corporately. And that's the end of my remarks right now.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, Jennifer, for those good words. We've heard now from an early career and a mid-career, and we've got a lot of research content behind us. We're going to spend with a little Q&A, and I'll set up these questions, and we'll have Bryan. And if you have more, I have several in already in the Q&A. If you can go ahead and enter a question there. Bryan, maybe you want to just start with this first question that has popped up. Bob Mann has put in, how do you distinguish personal ambition from God's calling? If a sense of calling or a sense of, this is a very personal drivenness.
Well, that's a great question. And I would say, and you'll hear this from me a lot, I mean, a huge part of discerning and living a calling is recognizing that these are decisions that are best made not in a vacuum, but within the context of community. And so this very event that we're engaged in tonight is an example of, learning from each other, bouncing ideas off of each other. I wish we had more time to do that in those breakout sessions. When I talk with people about this from a counselor perspective, I encourage them to think about, companies have boards of directors. What would it be like to name a personal board of directors? A list of 3 to 5 people who, are in your life, who know you well, who can give you candid feedback, who are mentor types, who want the best for you, who don't have an agenda, but who can be honest. And, I think we have interests and I don't know that there's anything inherently wrong with ambition per se, but it's one of those, potential dark sides of a calling. Sometimes ambition can blur, kind of drift from something that is motivating and animating and exciting into something that becomes an idol, right? And so all of us have a responsibility to kind of be mindful of what that looks like in our own lives, but we also know we have blind spots, and in order to do that, we have to lean in to the community around us, and live in such a way where we're sharing what's on our hearts and our walks, and inviting people to kind of call us out when they see that drift happening and ask the penetrating, challenging questions. And we have to be open to dealing with that when people give us that feedback.
Bryan, that's quintessential ASA answer. That is, in fact, one of the key parts of our mission, right? Issues is one, but we're a fellowship. We're a network. We are a community. And that's a vital thing that happens. As you say, this meeting tonight is an example of that. And it is, I've seen that in my own life too. That's interesting. There are a couple more questions that are coming in. One that came up was what is the role of unexpected events, contingencies in life? because we were kind of directed as thinking about, oh, I'm going to this step and that step. What about chance?
Yeah. This is a fun one. We call like psychologists call these things serendipitous events. Christians would call these providential events. But there's a whole counseling strategy designed to leverage these kinds of things. It's called planned happenstance. It's this idea that you talk to people who have had successful careers and you ask them to tell you your story or their story. You're going to hear a lot of, well, and then out of the blue, this happened, and I decided to follow that. These kind of unexpected things. But if you break it down, usually those things are not necessarily like they're unexpected when they happen, but they're not usually out of the blue. Usually these unexpected events happen because we engage life in such a way where we invite them to happen, right? So if you live an active life, and this is a little bit easier for extroverts probably than people who are lower in extroversion, but if you put yourself out there and introduce yourself to people, share with them what you're excited about, go to different events, new learning opportunities, that kind of thing, the more active you are, the more likely it becomes that one of these events turns into something that could be a legit opportunity, right? So I don't know. Sometimes, back when we could fly on airplanes, my default is to do like Joshua Ho and put the headset on. If somebody says, "What do you do?" I say, "I sell insurance," so that I could have a quiet, plane ride the rest of the time. But the planned happenstance people would say, "No, this is an opportunity for you to, introduce yourself to someone. You have no idea what that person is about, what what you might connect with and join with." And I'll tell you, back when we were trying to get Jobsology off the ground, one of the people that was helping us with this just told our story to a guy he was sitting by on a plane, and that guy ended up becoming our lead investor. So this is just one of those, like, the more active a life you lead, the more likely it is that these unexpected events happen. And then it requires wisdom to be able to discern, is this an event that really aligns with my gifts, that allows me to do something that, expands the influence I can have for the kingdom? It still requires wisdom, and then leveraging, your community and that kind of thing to sort that through. But that's a cool question, because that is something that we can actively try to make happen by the way we engage the world.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. I've got another question here. Are people who select a vocation, this is from Veronica Franz, are people who select a vocation with a broad range of job possibilities more likely to find purpose for those who, and I'm thinking against those who specialize? So if you have a broad career,
this is why in my breakout room, I was excited to hear people talk about their callings, because usually when you ask people, do you have a calling? And if so, what is it? Very seldom do people describe their calling with a job title. It's almost always about something bigger. Callings transcend a particular job title. And so, you go into a room with educators at a college, hardly anybody says, "I feel called to be a biology professor." What they say is, "I feel called to discover more about the world, or to help people brimming with potential optimize that potential," or whatever. And that, I think, is super important, because especially in a climate like during this pandemic, where a lot of people feel vulnerable, when whatever job you're in, that's never guaranteed. When that goes away, there are probably lots of other opportunities that might look a lot different that would still allow you to be faithful to, or to pursue what, how you answered that question. So, in a practical sense, sure, if you are studying a path that provides a huge array of options, is partly why it's my story, partly why I went into counseling psych instead of like human factors or something that was much more narrow, then you'll have more options. That's definitely the case. But even if you think your path is highly specialized and narrow, there are these kind of like meta skills that you possess that are far more generalizable than you probably realize. And so I think there's a broader array of options through which they could live their calling than they really appreciate. So yeah, great question.
Yeah. I've got another one that I think follows up on this. This is a question about that word calling itself. It says, when you use the phrase calling, it sounds to this person like there's one thing there that you've got to get it right. You have to find that. It's like Ulee's Gold in the comedy. What's the one thing that you have to find? So, is there a better way to describe these transitions? Because transitions seem to be important in many people's lives.
Yeah, I think it's really common to think of a calling this way, and this is the way I thought about it. I don't want to get it wrong. I might make the wrong choice and then live outside the center of God's will and be miserable my whole life. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted the answer. And a calling is, first of all, it's very broad. I think it's also fluid. You talk with people who've been at it for a long time, and they can talk about how their calling evolved. When we constructed that calling and vocation questionnaire, we had some subscales, and one of them was a seeking a calling subscale. So we had presence of calling and seeking a calling. We assumed that those would be negatively correlated. Like, people are seeking calling because they don't know what their calling is. But once they discover what their calling is, then they won't seek it anymore because they've got it, right? And what we found was that those scores on those two scales were not only positively correlated, they were so strongly positively correlated, it was like 0.77, that we had to conclude that these are actually like tapping into the same phenomenon. And of course, I see this now. We were talking about this in my breakout group. Like, part of having a calling means you are constantly asking questions about how you can do more of this, or it's almost like, by definition, part of having a calling means you're seeking one all the time. It's an ongoing process. It's not a thing to be discovered that once you discover it, you ride off into the sunset. And I can go on and on about what this looks like in my own life, because I sort of constantly obsess about this question. Is there something else I should be doing or can be doing more effectively or in a different way? I think that's part of the journey, honestly. So I say that even while saying I feel like I'm living my calling, but it's not something that I discovered when I was, a young adult, and now I'm just sort of have continued on since then without, it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, Bryan, I share your feeling about obsessing about this over your lifetime. Somebody gave me advice early on about my faith life. They said, am I a Christian? Am I really saved or not? And I said, it's kind of like putting a plant in the ground and you start to let it grow. Well, don't pull it out every couple of weeks and see if the roots are growing. It just helps if you put it in the ground and just leave it alone. And that was great advice.
That's a great metaphor.
So here's an interesting question that's come from Scott Stewart. And Scott asks this. He says, in our sessions, we all struggled a bit with identifying our calling. But just because we may not necessarily like what it is that we're doing, does that mean that it's not our calling? Is it possible that we may not particularly like the thing that we're actually called to do? So that's an interesting question.
Yeah, I said a little before, like, callings transcend job titles. There's also, I think every job, because we live in this fallen world, includes an element of daily grind. Some of us have really felt that in a big way during this pandemic. Feels like weeks go by and everything just seems to require so much effort and extra effort. And there's just sort of like so many barriers that get in the way to the parts of the job that really feel like, hey, this is the stuff I most enjoy. Administrative duties and endless complaints about students about their grade, I mean, it's that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think in the ideal world, a person is able to find a job that maximizes the opportunity to express one's gifts and engage in projects and tasks that are really life-giving, that are enjoyable, that align with what matters most to you, that leverage the strengths that you have. But in the real world, most of us have to make compromises. And so, from a career counseling perspective, I think the question is, it's always one of, to what extent do you have the latitude to improve the situation that you're in right now? Or should you be open and looking for other opportunities that would align better with what you would, experience as a calling?
Right. That's great advice. Someone once said to me that, there are bedpans in every business, John, and they have to be empty. So, choose the job you're going to have. You're going to find those kinds of problems. And then the other piece of advice, along just the line you just said, a pastor's wife one time said, you sound uncomfortable with what you're doing right now. God wants to do one of two things. He either wants to change your job, or he wants to change you. An interesting question that has come up from several people. Paul mentions this, and he's talking about how relevant are questions regarding calling to a person on a production line who has a kind of, doesn't feel like the sort of typical professional kind of thing. Maybe you're working from an Amazon distribution system, and so or you have a kind of we might call it a really secular job that doesn't feel like. You go ahead and do that.
Yeah, well, it's an important question, and there are probably a lot of different angles from which to approach it. I mean, part of what it points to when you're talking about production lines is when we talk about calling, we often frame it from the perspective of the individual. We live out, we construct, we discern our own callings, but that always happens in a context. And I think there's some research emerging on dignity of work and decent work. And there's a sense in which, in order for people to really fully engage their work in a way where they're able to experience the fruits of what comes with a calling, it has to have dignity. It can't be something that doesn't allow them to meet their needs, for putting food on the table, for accessing health care. It has to be a safe environment. It has to, you can think about this from the famous, hierarchy of needs from Abraham Maslow, which you think back to your intro psych course. We're probably not thinking a lot about meaning and purpose in our work when we're struggling just to get by. And so I do think it's really important to recognize that. And, policies and employers are not off the hook. There is a responsibility to create conditions in which people can flourish. And there are bigger questions about how well working on a production line can succeed at allowing people to engage in creative service the way maybe you could say we're created to, be human. But even so, in Make Your Job a Calling, we have a chapter on callings outside of work. It is completely legitimate for people, and in fact, a lot of artists do this. A lot of studio artists. It's very difficult to earn a living creating, sculpture and paintings and that kind of thing. And some people are able to do it, but a lot of people who feel like that's what they're on this earth to do, they're not able to do that without supporting it with a day job, right? And so, there's a crusty old vocational psychologist at Stanford named John Crumboltz said once, he said, the role of a career counselor is to help clients live satisfying lives. And what he meant by that was it's way more than just work. So we can talk about multiple callings. We can also talk about different strategies for living a calling both within and outside of or beyond paid employment. And, there's really no judgment. I mean, I focus on work because that's what I'm trained to focus on, but we have to think, I think, very holistically about things. And if part of the goal is being faithful to what God's equipped us with in terms of our gifts and engaging in the world such a way where we're expressing those gifts to make things better, we certainly are doing that in other arenas beyond work. So if we're in an employment situation where we don't feel we're able to sufficiently express our gifts, that doesn't mean we can't do it. It just means we have to think more broadly about what that might look like within the broader array of our responsibilities and opportunities in life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brian. That's very pointed. And the analogy to artists and this kind of a bivocationalism, the real calling piece. I see that in my own children, and who my son and daughter-in-law are both artists and performers, and they don't make a living at that. They can't.
Yeah.
But they've managed to find a way to have very satisfying day jobs and do this that enables them to do this other thing as well.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting approach. Well, let's see. Another personal kind of question that has come in and from Lauren is that discernment is the most difficult aspect for me. So even when I focus my prayer and energy on listening to God to guide me, I find that I'm struggling internally with knowing whether I made the correct decision. If I remember your testimony here a few minutes ago, Brian, you have a lot of experience with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how can these skills and tools now that you've put in front of us assist us in discernment?
Yeah, this is exactly, I think, why I felt paralyzed. There was this fear that I would get it wrong. If I make the wrong choice, then I'd be, kind of doomed to live outside of the center of God's will or whatever. And I'm not a theologian, except for in the sense that all of us are, right? So I wouldn't claim to be an expert on the theological way of approaching that. But if you read theologians on this, they'll say that, God's will is an interesting thing. I mean, if you read in Scripture, there are certain aspects of God's will that are very, very clear. God's will of decree. It's clear in Scripture that, God is sovereign over everything. It's clear in Scripture how God wants us to be obedient. That part of God's will is clear. But it's that will of direction that we struggle with. What does God want me to do next in my life? And, I think it's important to point out that a lot of theologians express that we have some freedom. If there was one right choice for us, then probably it would be easier for us to figure out what that is. And I think if you take a step back, it's okay to think about it a little bit differently and say, I think there are probably multiple right choices. And we have the freedom to make a choice about what we're going to do with wisdom. And if you do that in a prayerful way, paying attention to the things that you'd pay attention to make a wise choice, like what your gifts are, what the opportunities and needs in the world are. You do this within the context of community, not just in your own head. So you're leaning on wisdom and support of others in your life who care about you. Then you can make a choice and go forward trusting that God will take that choice and conform it to His will for your life going forward. That, I think, is another thing that I would coach the 19-year-old me on. It's like, don't worry so much about there being one right answer. There's probably more than one right answer. And so have the freedom to choose one and go forward. So some people ask me, what if I had chosen one of the other, like, what if I actually had more credits in another thing that I was considering, like business or sociology or religion and theology or that kind of thing. And when I think about it, I think, if I had chosen one of those paths, probably my life would have turned out a bit differently, but to the extent that any of those would still have allowed me to express my gifts in a way that was satisfying to me personally and that made some kind of meaningful difference in the world, addressed a need, I would probably feel still like, yeah, I made a good choice for me and I'm living out my calling now, even though it's a little bit mind-bending to think about an alternative reality in which that had been the case. But all of this is to say, I don't think for most of us, there's one right answer, and there's a huge amount of pressure to get that right, and that we're at risk of getting it wrong and then living outside of God's will. The key is make decisions in a way that's guided by prayerful wisdom, using all the information that we know helps shape decisions that point to good outcomes. And that's really like a big piece of what I tried hard to address in redeeming work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brian. That's really insightful. I mean, the two things there you talk about, community and that's what we're called to be, members and believers, a community of believers in faith. We are the body of Christ. No. And then the confidence that we have that the Lord will guide us. Yeah. And then those are two touch points. So very interesting. I go to another question, somewhat related, is what's the role of the unexpected in the contingencies of life, in calling? There's the unexpected, the providential, the contingent things that happen. What does that have to do with?
Yeah, it's a great question, because if you talk to people who have had long, fruitful careers, it is very, very common that when they tell the story of their career, they'll point to some kind of unexpected event that led them in a new direction or created a new opportunity they didn't foresee. The vocational psychologists call these serendipitous events. Christians, we might focus on them as providential events. But there's actually a whole kind of career counseling strategy to capitalize on the importance of these things. It's called planned happenstance, which is a bit of an oxymoron, right? Planned happenstance. Mm-hmm. But basically, it's recognizing the idea that these so-called unexpected events are not necessarily like out of the blue. We can increase the likelihood that we will experience an unplanned event, that creates a new opportunity by merely living an active life. So by attending lots of events like this one, by networking, by putting ourselves out there, introducing ourselves to things, by talking to the person you're sitting next to on the plane when we can fly again, instead of just some kind of real opportunity that could be a legitimate option for you going forward. And then, of course, whenever that happens, you still have to lean on wisdom in your decision making. But yeah, I think that's pretty cool. I mean, it's sort of this idea that we can actually create those kinds of unplanned events by simply engaging the world in a really active way. And then trying to always ask yourself, okay, it's this event that I wasn't thinking about until I met this person. Is this something that will allow me to express my gifts in ways that, make the world better?
You got one last question as we draw our evening to the close. And this comes from a friend of mine who has actually written on the notion of work loves our neighbor. And he asked the question this way. He said, where in your career do you really find your calling? Do you find it early? Do you find it mid? Do you find it late? What would be your advice about thinking about that? Does it come early? Does it come middle? Does it come later? Where's the sort of optimal time? Is there anything in the research that would speak to that?
Well, there's surprisingly little research that kind of tracks a calling over the lifespan. As you can imagine, it's a challenge to do that. You can rely on retrospective accounts. Mm-hmm. And I think when the older people get, the more experience they get behind them and the further along they get, it is kind of striking. We are meaning-making creatures, right? And a lot of us, there's a lot of people, you look at their career path, if you were reading their resume, it would look like this chaotic bouncing around. But it's incredible if you ask people to tell the story of their career. They're able to weave a common thread that ties a lot of those what might appear to be disparate things together. And so, I mean, I'm not directly answering your question, but, I think if you're looking for it, then you can find it or create it or engage it all across the course of a career. It just looks a little bit different, right? It looks a little bit different. I mean, for someone who's just starting out, they're brimming with hope. They haven't experienced the things that makes a person jaded and discouraged. For somebody who's kind of like middle career, my stage, there's this sort of reopening of questions like, okay, what should I be doing? Right? There's kind of a new exploration of, are there new ways I haven't really explored to kind of make this work? And then when you're later in your career, you're engaging in some review, you're thinking about legacy, but you're also looking ahead and thinking about, encore careers and, retirement, volunteer opportunities. I mean, there's, you have both a wealth of experience you can draw from that you didn't have earlier. And, you may also have fewer constraints in terms of finances. There are other constraints, health related and so forth as people age. But I don't know, that's a tough, I don't think that, I don't feel comfortable saying, here's the point in the lifespan where this is really relevant. To me, if we're doing this right, then it's a thread that we kind of weave through no matter what stage we're at.
And with that, Bryan, you just summed up why we wanted to have this evening together. Because we wanted to talk about exactly that conversation, have that conversation. Thanks for that. Maybe you have a few brief final words you want to give to us, and then we'll have Vicki close our evening. But it's been so great. I've been seeing in the chat here people saying thanks and shout outs. I don't know if your function for reaction is there and you can do a hand clap or not, but it's really been great to, let's see if I can see it down, reactions. Yeah, so there you go.
Yeah.
It's been great, Bryan, so thank you. Go ahead.
I've really enjoyed it, and I don't have much else to say other than I just so appreciate the chance to join with like-minded people who are working out these kinds of things together. I'll just double down on the importance of doing this within a community. It's just so critical. This is, we live in this hugely individualistic society, at least those of us in North America. And it is so important to take a step back from that and say, you know what, I'm not my own. We belong to the Lord. But we're also working out our faith in all our various life roles. We talk mostly about work and career tonight, but in every life role we have, we're living out a calling. And if we're going to do this right, we have to do it together with encouragement, with the great cloud of witnesses that's gone before us. I think that's the way we're made. And so, we just have to double down on it. And tonight was an example of that, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Bryan. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Josh. What a great evening, and thank you all for joining us. As we wrap up the meeting, I want to provide a couple of closing reminders. If you didn't receive a copy of Bryan's book again, you can get it on Amazon. I encourage you to do so. Also, pleased to announce ASA's new and improved Career Center. So job seekers, your next career opportunity is at your fingertips. And employers, you can find and hire top professionals. So check out our website. There's a plethora of career resources, featured jobs, and much more. If you're not an ASA member and you're here with us tonight, we'd love to welcome you into membership. Becky will post a link in the chat box, but check out our website. You can learn more about the ASA, our membership benefits, local chapters, our programming, and much more. Student memberships are free, so if there's students in the crowd, you can join free of charge. And as we enter this season of Thanksgiving, we just wanted to reiterate how grateful we are for all of you who have been so supportive over the years, and particularly the last 7 months, as it's been necessary for us to quickly pivot and reposition our business model. But God has surprised us in many ways over the last several months by providing financially. So thank you to all of you who have sent in gifts. You should receive our annual fund appeal in the mail early next week. And so we would just ask that you would prayerfully consider a gift as you feel led and are able. We have a couple of upcoming events that we're looking forward to. First, on November 19th at 2 o'clock, we're going to do another brown bag lunch with Frank Robinson, who spoke here at the Boston chapter about a month ago. He's going to speak again on asymptomatic racism, the silent contagion of hatred in us all. It's a great talk, so I would encourage you to attend. And then in January, we're planning for a day conference on January 30th, a national virtual event. We have an exciting speaker that we have lined up to be announced soon, with each chapter providing their own local flair. So stay tuned for all the details surrounding that particular event. And now I just want to close us with a word of prayer. So would you bow your heads with me, please? Lord, thank you for each person here tonight and for a wonderful evening of exploring the science of discerning our calling and vocation together. Thanks for the stimulating and insightful presentations, the stories, the conversations of listening and learning from each other. We know that the most urgent call upon us as God's people is to live as followers of Christ. We're grateful that you call each of us for a specific purpose while here on earth, and no matter our age or our circumstance, your desire is to see us be difference makers for your kingdom. As ASA members and friends living out our vocation and calling, as Christians in the sciences, we long to renew our hope in this broken and hurting world. Lord, help us to be a bridge, modeling understanding and dialogue among the public, the scientific community, and the church, and give us boldness to encourage the Christian community to reflect deeply about the natural world. Equip us with the ability to adapt to our current changing reality. And it is we, God's people, living in the power of the Holy Spirit, who are called to live with hope and joy and flourish while here on earth. We are made and redeemed for this calling, but oftentimes it slides through our fingers. May you give us the lens of connecting our Sunday worship to our Monday work, and that boldly living and practicing the who and why we are, no matter what our age or stage in life, is our Christian vocation and true calling, whenever and wherever we may be. Go with us now. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Good evening, everybody. Good night and God bless.